So here we are, part 2 of our video series, the 5 approaches to health. And what we're going to be looking at in this second part is what I call levels 1 to 3. And I want to be quite clear that when I talk about approaches to health, I'm not talking about specific health modalities such as acupuncture or Reiki or going to see a naturopath. You're going to see that what I'm talking about is something quite different, and that in fact those different modalities are going to sit within one of these levels. Now, in case you did miss the first video, let's have a very, very brief recap of the first video where we talked about the fact that we live in a world which has been split up actually into 3 worlds, where we're either classified as living in a first world country or a second world country or a third world country. And the truth of the matter is that every different continent and country and culture has developed its own healthcare system. And primarily, I grew up in a system which comes under the first world healthcare system. And what I've experienced through my own 25-year journey of having to find or wanting to find other solutions apart from medication or surgery is that there are many, many, many different approaches of healthcare that we can implement to look after our health or recover from a chronic illness. So last time we looked at the fact that Western medicine is primarily based on disease management and germ theory and genetics, and primarily focusing on the physical. So in the body, that will be at a chemistry level, at a cellular level, a physical level. And so that's known as physics. And it tends to just address the end result. So somebody walks in and says, oh, I've got this rash. And rather than asking, why is the rash there? It's like, okay, you got a rash. Here's a cream that can help you not feel that rash. And that is in large part the way that modern medicine addresses these sort of illnesses, these sort of conditions. And it also has an approach that disease is either genetic and therefore it's passed down and there's nothing you can do about it, and that genes are set, and that disease is random or fate or a mistake. But medicine has now been superseded for the last 10, 20 years by what is now known, but not very well known, as metamedicine. And metamedicine means beyond. So, for example, epigenetics has now proven that genes are turned on and off by our environment, which means they are not set. It means that we can change our genes because they are turned on or off, and medically they say that means they are expressed by what happens in our environment. It's because of our response internally to what is going on mentally and emotionally that affects our genes. And metamedicine also takes a helicopter view of a person's life and their whole being, and takes into account their mind, their beliefs, their emotions, their spirit, their energy. Everything is taken into account. And it also goes to a much deeper level of quantum physics, which modern medicine is now incorporating, I would say, but it wasn't 20 years ago. But we go much deeper to a much more quantum level than just a physical level. So we could say that the physical level deals with a cellular level, so objects that are in the cell or at a cellular level, whereas quantum physics goes down, if you were to say under a microscope, 1 million times more deep than a cellular level. So it's going to this microscopic level, going to the smallest particle of matter, which is called a quantum. And as you're going to see as we go through this presentation, that some of these newer healthcare approaches go down to this quantum level. And another really important factor is that in metamedicine, we are focusing on isolating and identifying and then addressing the real root cause of the problem. We are not dealing with the end result. we are going to the root and we are pulling that plant out by its root so that we're not just trimming the leaves. Because if we just trim the leaves, then the root is going to continue to grow. And metamedicine also understands, because it has this much more helicopter view of everything. It's not down on the ground just looking at a chair from the ground. It is right up above looking at the house with the chair in it and the fields surrounding the house. It has a much bigger perspective and viewpoint. And so it understands that there's always a reason for dis-ease. And if we address and identify the root cause of the dis-ease, then we're going to have a much better opportunity for restoring our wholeness, which is our health. And if you remember, the real meaning of health, which we discussed in the previous video, is wholeness. Now, if you haven't watched the previous video, please do go back and watch it at some point. I also mentioned in the previous video the fact that all truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. And third, it is accepted as self-evident. And so I invite you to keep an open mind as I go through the next 2 videos, because I may well say some things that you find a little bit strange. So some of you may be thinking, oh my God, this woman's speaking a complete load of rubbish. I don't get what she's talking about at all. And that's fine. Others of you will be listening and going, oh my God, I have been waiting for this piece of the puzzle. I am so glad I'm watching this video. And as you're going to see, a lot of this has to do with our level of consciousness. And I remember, for example, about 20 years ago, when somebody I was living with, I was flatting, gave me a book by Louise Hay called You Can Heal Your Life. And I opened it up, and the book was written in English, and I started reading the first chapter. And even though I was reading English words, none of it made sense to me. And so I read a couple of paragraphs and thought, no, this looks really interesting, but I just knew that I wasn't ready to read the book. So I gave it back to her and I said, listen, thanks very much, but I can't even understand what it's saying. It's like it's written in another language, even though it's English. And about a year later, I came across that book again, and I picked it up and I read the same page and the same paragraphs, and all of a sudden they made sense. So what had changed in that time? The book had not changed and the words on the page had not changed. But what had changed was my level of understanding and my level of consciousness. And I was able to open myself up to understand what those words meant. And this is part of what we have to do in our journey of evolution of health. And what I'm trying to do in this video series is to give the people that are ready to hear this information, because it can be life transforming. Now, I also mentioned in the last video how we have this electromagnetic spectrum, which shows all the different types of light that are available to us. And the really interesting thing is that this electromagnetic spectrum only represents 0.005% of everything that exists. It is a tiny, tiny fraction of everything that exists in the known universe. And visible light is only a fraction of that 0.0005%. And what I was trying to get across in this metaphor is the fact that just because we don't see something does not mean it doesn't exist. It does not mean that it is not a valid reality. And this is what I'm finding with a lot of people that I speak to, is they are only aware of what is the current prevailing medical system in our Western first world society. And that is a doctor, or what is also quite well known now is things like osteopath, acupuncture, or a naturopath. And these are all valid systems. And for some people, they may view naturopathy, osteopathy, chiropractic, TCM, acupuncturists, etc. For them, that may actually be all they know of alternative therapies. But I can assure you that is still scratching the surface, as you're about to see in the rest of this series. So let's get started on these first 3 levels of healthcare. Now, I have alluded to already the fact that a human being is not just a physical body. We have our physical body, we have our mental part of ourselves, which is the mind, we have our emotional part, which is our emotions and feelings, we have the spiritual part of us that is going to be very different for everybody because everybody's got different spiritual beliefs, and we have energy. And we're going to be looking at all 5 levels of this as we go through the video. And I'm going to start with level 1 healthcare, which I've called physical medicine. And physical medicine focuses on physical results and trying to work backwards from the end result. And as I mentioned before, often the cause is not known, or it is seen as random, or it is seen as being a physical cause, or maybe it could be something in the environment. It could be germs, it could be bugs, it could be pollen. But the main point here is that the cause of the illness is either unknown, or it's random, could be genetic, or it's something physical. And we're going to start with the doctor, the medical system, the medical specialist. And we're going to look at, for each of these different levels, which we're going to go through, and there are 5 levels altogether of healthcare, which I'm going to go through in this series. I'm going to start off by looking at certain common illnesses. So here we've got flu, depression, asthma, back pain, a bladder infection, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, or cancer. And what we're going to do when we go to each level is we're going to look at the same health conditions, but we're going to look at how each level of healthcare will address these health conditions in a different way. So in general, we could say that if we go to a doctor or a medical specialist, then, say for example, we have flu, then the likely solution is going to be medication or bed rest. Depression is likely to be medication that is recommended. Asthma, the same, medication. Back pain might be medication, it might go to surgery. But the main solution here, as far as doctor and specialists are concerned in the medical system, the main solution and approach is going to be either medication or surgery or rest. Now, if we look at the cause of the illness as given mainly by doctors or specialists in this system, mainly, for example, for a flu, it might be bacteria or viruses. So here we have the germ theory still playing out. If it's depression, it may be, well, because your unhappiness, so that's become worse, or it may be genetics. For example, asthma, it would be, well, maybe there's pollens, or maybe it's genetic, or maybe it's just random. If it was back pain, it might be, well, you've physically strained yourself or injured yourself or had an accident. If it was a bladder infection, again, it comes back to the germ theory. If it was chronic fatigue, the main thing that is still being said at the moment is there is no known cause for chronic fatigue, and that is just absolute rubbish. There is absolutely a reason for getting chronic fatigue, as we're going to see later. Or maybe it's a virus, and again, that myth has been completely blown through the other theories that I've trained in. The virus is not the root cause. Fibromyalgia, again, no known cause at the moment according to medical specialists, or maybe it's a virus. And cancer, again, no known cause, or maybe it's genetics. There's quite a lot of emphasis on the fact that it's genetics, or it could be random, which doesn't give us a lot of power, does it, when it's always something outside of us? Which brings me to the last column here, which is where we have an external practitioner telling us what is wrong with a focus on a physical cause and a physical solution, but no known real identification of that cause. And this is quite disempowering. This whole system is quite disempowering. So let's move up to, again, we're still on level 1, which is the physical, but let's move to different type of practitioner here, osteopath, chiropractor, physio. And the interesting thing is the osteopath was the first non-doctor practitioner that I ever went to in my life. So that's about 30 years ago now. And I was in London and I hurt my back. And after several weeks of feeling this strain in my back, but really not knowing what to do about it, somehow, I don't know if it was the Yellow Pages, I can't remember, but somehow I found my way to an osteopath. And that was the first time I'd been to any other practitioner than a doctor. And it was a revelation to me. Now, fortunately, osteopaths and chiropractors are a lot more what I call mainstream now. They are very well accepted into the mainstream, and that's great. But let's look at how they would approach these health conditions. Now, for the flu, there's not a lot they could necessarily do. A cranial osteopath may be able to help move the craniosacral fluid and adjust some of the tissues in the body. But again, we're talking physical. Depression, not a lot potentially they can do. Asthma, potentially not a lot. Back pain, they obviously going to help manipulate, whether that's through literally manipulating the bones or through craniosacral manipulation. But for the other conditions here, bladder infection, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, or cancer, they're probably not going to be the type of healthcare practitioner that we're going to go to for these conditions. And again, as far as looking at the cause of the illness, they may be quite similar to how a doctor or a specialist may look at these conditions. And again, we may have the external practitioner telling us what is wrong and the focus being on a physical solution and looking at things from a physical perspective, because we're still at level 1 here, physical. And if we look at a naturopath, which again, fortunately, are much more accepted now than they were 20 years ago, but they're still not considered Western medicine or mainstream, really. But they will have a very different solution or approach to a doctor. Their main solution is going to be the use of herbs or the use of supplements in addressing what is going on chemically in the body. So it's going to be things like looking at deficiencies, vitamin deficiencies, mineral deficiencies, helping to boost the function of cells. And the way that that is going to be done is through the use of herbs or supplements. And by the way, I do want to stress that just because we're going through these different levels, I'm not saying that 1 or 2 is better than 1, or 3 is better than 2, or 4 is better than 3. What I'm saying is we need to know all these different levels and choose what is the most useful for us, which may well be a mixture of many different levels. And if we look at what is the cause of illness according to the way the naturopath sees the world, there's going to be a similarity here to what the doctor may say, plus there's going to be this focus on mineral deficiency, vitamin deficiency, and what I've called here cellular underfunction or cellular dysfunction. And I could have written that in each of these rows here, but there just wasn't the space. But they're still looking at it from a physical perspective. And the result is still an external practitioner telling us what is wrong and mainly focusing on using a physical solution, in other words, herbs or supplements, to address the cause of the problem at a chemistry or cellular level. They will also be starting to look more at what is going on emotionally and in our environment. But we're still at level 1 here. We're still down at focusing on things from a physical level. So the summary of level 1 is that physical symptoms are treated predominantly with a physical means. So whether that's a medication or a surgery or a supplement or a herb, that is the predominant means of addressing the symptoms. And the cause of the illness is still predominantly seen as something physical. And this is what I call level 1 healthcare. So now let's move to level 2, which is what I've called energy medicine. And energy medicine takes into account the fact that we as human beings are made of energy. We are energy. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with theory of quantum physics, but science has now proven beyond doubt that all matter is at its core energy. So to give a really easy example, if you were to take a cell of a human being and put it under a microscope and magnify that cell 1,000,000 times, you would no longer see that cell as appearing as physical matter. Instead, it would look like energy and waves of energy. Now, isn't that bizarre how we have trillions of cells inside our body and we look and feel so solid, and yet if you separate out one cell and magnify it 1,000,000 times, it only looks like energy. In other words, there's no solidity to it anymore. And if you were to do that for every cell in your body, that means that fundamentally you have no solidity. Now, that is quite bizarre for my mind to comprehend, but I do believe it to be true as a result of some of the training that I've done and even some of the books that I've read. And I always remember reading a Shirley MacLaine book years ago, even before I got into natural health. And she was talking about this trip she was taking in South America. I think it was South America. And she went to see this doctor who did spiritual surgery. And he invited her into the room to watch what he was doing. And she observed with her own eyes this doctor putting his hand into this person's body. And she literally saw the doctor put his hands into this person's body and thought, oh my goodness, what on earth is he doing? And then the doctor invited her to put her hand into the cavity in this body. And she was like, no way. It's just going to come out blood and guts and no, thank you. But either he persuaded her or she decided that she would. But either way, she did it. And she put her hand into this person's body. And all she could feel was space. Now, I know that may seem really far-fetched, and I can explain later when we get to level 4 and 5 what is happening there. But fundamentally, what I'm trying to get across here is that we are made of energy. We are energy beings, even though we appear solid as matter. And it's really, really important to understand this if we want to understand health. And the ancient Chinese have known this for thousands of years. And that is why most of their healthcare systems are based around managing energy. So let's look at some of these approaches with energy medicine. Now, the first energy medicine I'm going to talk about is acupuncture. And you may be familiar with these type of diagrams which show acupuncture meridians or lines of energy in the body, which have been known for thousands and thousands of years by the ancient Chinese. And one of their methods of dealing with illness is acupuncture, which comes under the banner of traditional Chinese medicine. And if you go to an acupuncturist and you have any of these health conditions, then the approach is going to be something like acupuncture, which is putting needles in to stimulate the energy pathways, or herbs or moxa, all of which are meant to clear energy pathways in the body. And if you ask an acupuncturist what is the cause of illness, they're going to say it's a depletion or excess or blockage in life force energy or qi in the body. And that is creating the result of XYZ illness. So they're going to look at it from a very, very different perspective than from our current Western medical system. It's always about energy. But it's still an external practitioner telling us what is wrong, and their focus is going to be an energetic solution, and mainly the cause is still not really being identified at this point. They're still dealing with the end result. So in other words, you go to an acupuncturist and they say, well, what's wrong? What are your symptoms? And you say, okay, well, I've got a blocked nose and blocked lungs. And they go, okay, so that means that your spleen qi or your lung qi or your large intestine qi or whatever qi is deficient or excessive or blocked here or blocked there. And we need to clear that block over here so that more energy is directed over there. So they're still focusing on changing the end result. They're not really tracking back to why is that qi blocked or deficient. So the summary of level 2 medicine is traditional Chinese medicine sees that the body is run by energy and addresses the situation by changing the flow of that energy. And just to give a really simple example to finish with, if you imagine that you have these rivers of energy inside your body, if suddenly a dam gets built across the river, then it starts to build up and there's stagnant water on one side maybe and no water on the other side. And so what Chinese medicine will do is to help clear that dam so that the river is free flowing again. So let's move on to level 3, which is still energy medicine, but it takes into account more levels of our being. So energy medicine does take into account the fact that we are made of energy, but it takes into account not just the physical, not just energy, but also emotional, spiritual, and mental. So let's look now at classical Chinese medicine. Now, I didn't know there was a difference between classical and Chinese medicine until I started learning Qigong. And I learned that during the Cultural Revolution of the 1940s, that classical Chinese medicine was stripped of its spirituality and left it with only traditional Chinese medicine, which is what most people know today. But classical Chinese medicine has been around for thousands of years, and it takes into account a much bigger picture than only traditional Chinese medicine, because it takes into account more the emotional, mental, and spiritual sides of a person. And there are some classical Chinese medicine acupuncturists around today, and I've done some training with one of these ladies, and she's written some amazing books. And rather than an acupuncture point just being a point that has a certain name, such as Gate of Life, Ming Men, and you put an acupuncture needle there, there's a spiritual meaning behind each acupuncture point, which points to the emotional causation of the problem as well. And it's very, very fascinating. So when you go to see a classical Chinese medicine acupuncturist, they're going to be unblocking energy, like we talked about with the TCM acupuncturist, but they're going to be taking into account the emotional side of things and maybe belief side of things as well, and the spiritual aspect of things. And so when they look at the cause of the illness, rather than it only being blocked energy or blocked qi, they're going to be looking at a much wider array of life factors, such as emotional trauma, past lives, environment, social, epigenetics. And I'm going to go more into what these things mean in a while. I'll just note them for the moment. But the point here is they look at a much broader concept of what causes illness. And although it's still the external practitioner helping the client to clear their energy, that practitioner is also bringing more self-awareness to the client. So they're starting to really think for themselves, and they're looking at things from a much more holistic point of view. Now, another level of energy medicine is very well known is the Brennan Model for the 7 levels of the human energy field. And here we have the human being, and using either special cameras or people who can actually see this themselves because they've developed their ability to be able to see other energy fields, we see that there is far more to a human being than just their physical body. And we were talking about that before when we were saying that the body is far more than just physical matter. It's actually energy, and we could say solidified energy. So energy medicine takes into account these different fields of our being. And so if you go to see an energy medicine practitioner, such as a Reiki practitioner or somebody who does energy healing or flower essences or even Nest Health, then they're going to have a very, very different viewpoint to what is the cause and solution to illness. The solution and the approach is always, it's about clearing energy, purifying it, transforming it, etc. Because there's a law of physics which says that energy can never be destroyed, but it can be transformed. And if you look at what causes illness, then again, these practitioners are going to be looking at all aspects of a person's life. They're going to look at the mind, their emotions, their energy, their spirit. They're going to be looking at perhaps past lives and karma and environment, social, and epigenetics. Epigenetics being what is it in your environment that is changing your genes. And again, it's still an external practitioner is helping to change the energy, but they are bringing more self-awareness to the patient or the client. And I want to say that I have trained in most of these methods here. I've trained in energy healing and flower essences and nest health, and it is all fascinating stuff. So the next level, in level 3, is emotional. And this is where feelings come into it. So if we look at emotional healing, and there are many different methods, for example, the emotion code, Mickle therapy, motivational medicine, advanced clearing energetics, all of which I've trained in, they will have a very, very different perspective compared to back to level 1 of what creates the problem. The solution is always going to be centered around clearing energy, and in particular, clearing emotional energy and trauma from the cells. If we go back to quantum physics and the fact that we are made of energy, that means our physical body is made of energy, but also our thoughts are energy, which means our mind is energy, our emotions and feelings are energy, and of course, the spiritual aspect of ourselves is energy. So emotional healing is really focusing on the emotional energy because everything is energy. And so whatever that energy is, whether it's a thought or a feeling, it is in the body at a cellular level somehow. And that cellular level is also mirrored at a quantum level. So when you go to see somebody who does emotional healing, they're going to be looking at what happened in your childhood. What emotional trauma did you experience in your childhood? And how did that emotional trauma, if it was not cleared or dissolved or resolved at the time, and it's still trapped in your body, and that energy is still trapped in your body, how is that energy impacting the cells of your body? How is that energy impacting the functioning of your cells? And how is that energy creating symptoms? And this was one of the turning points for me, was understanding that holding all my emotional energy inside me and not dealing with it was creating debilitating symptoms. And, you know, it may sound quite strange that emotions can have such an effect physically, but I can assure you they can, and they do. So when you go and see an emotional healing practitioner, they're going to be looking very thoroughly and deeply at the emotional side of things. And that is one of the areas that I focus on in my work with people. So again, we have the external practitioner assisting the client to clear their energy, and at the same time bringing a much higher level of awareness, much higher level of self-awareness to the client. So to summarize level 3, energy medicine and emotional healing take into account the fact that we as human beings are physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual, and that we need to address all these levels in order to restore our health, which, remember, health means wholeness. So in part 3 of this video series, we're going to be looking at the final 2 levels of healthcare. So far, we've just looked at physical, energetic, and emotional. And the next video will look at the next 2 levels, which go beyond that. So I hope this has been helpful. I encourage you to look at this again, if need be, because we don't always get everything on the first pass. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video.